Hi, everybody. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically what I'd like to do is go through a lot of the things that we've done up to this point. I think it's probably worth doing a review. I think also in sort of building some of this stuff, I've realized how we can make this a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably post these videos in I think 15-minute increments. We'll see how that turns out. I'm going to start out by doing creating a web MVC project, an empty project. Again, we'll deal with our contact, which has a first name, last name, a email address, as well as an ID. And we'll start out by creating our entity classes. Entity class, I should say. We'll create our business class, and then we'll go and create our controllers and get this thing up and running. So let's start out by opening up Visual Studio. And let's find this, Visual Studio. Okay. So I'm going to start out by creating a new project. This is going to be a web application. And I'm going to call this, same thing we've called it before, we'll just call it ContactWeb. Okay, I don't need a directory for the solution. So in MVC3, if you click OK, you have the ability of having an internet application. Intranet, not totally sure what that does. We're going to use the Razor view engine, and this is going to be an empty project, and we'll say OK. This is going to go and create a project for us. I've got the Solution Explorer closed here. What we're going to do here is we're going to create our model. This is going to be a widget class. And by default, it's basically going to put things inside of a namespace, which is the default namespace for our application. And then it'll end up default namespace for our application dot whatever the folder structure is that we have. So this is going to be our entity class. And what we'll do here is we're going to say prop tab. We'll say this is going to be an ID. Prop tab. This will be a string, and it'll be first name. Prop tab. This will be a string. I just realized I was working on another project. I called this widget. So I'm actually going to just save this. This is not going to be widget. This is going to be contact. I'm going to save it, and let me also just rename the file. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we've got something a little bit more meaningful than a widget. And we've got our first name, we've got our last name, and we've got our email address. I'm going to do one other thing here, because this is going to be useful when we end up doing our prefix. So what I'm going to do here is actually put another property here. Actually, two properties I could put. First of all, I could put a full name property. This is going to be a string. And this we're only going to have a get accessor. Right? I think what we're going to return here, we're going to use string.format so we don't have to concatenate any strings. So we've got first name, we've got last name, and we'll say first name, last name. Now, eventually we're going to end up putting some attributes on here to make the first name required, the last name required, and we'll do the email in a specific format. But what we can do now is I'm going to do one other thing. This is going to be helpful when we end up doing our paging. And what I'm going to do is say public, and this is going to be a string, and we'll say prefix, and this is going to be based upon the last name of the user, and this is going to be read-only as well. again, I'm assuming that the user is going to have a value, so I'm not going to let them save things if they don't have a first name and a last name. So I'm going to put a get accessor here. It's going to be read only. Return last name substring 0, 1, and I'm just going to make this uppercase. Okay. So now that we've done that, we've got our entity, and now we're going to go and create our business layer. Now, again, if this was an n-tiered application, what we would have is we'd have a business layer, and the business layer would have some way of finding out a valid data access layer, whether that data access layer was an XML file, a regular text file, whether it was an Access database, SQL Server, Oracle database, whatever it was. But here we're going to simplify things by not having that structure. We'll actually just put our business layer here, and our business layer is actually going to create these objects for us. We'll call this ContactBus. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, first of all, I'm going to start out by having a constant string, and this is going to be my cache key, and my cache key is going to be get contacts. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a, again, by default in C#, this is going to be read-only property. By default, it's going to be private. So I'm just going to say here, this is going to return a list of contact objects. It's going to be get contacts. It's going to be read-only. I'm not going to worry about setting it. So, sorry about that. This is going to be get. What I'm going to do here, and hold on, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. This is going to be my private property, which is going to be data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have actually a public property called get contacts, which is going to call data. And again, what I'm doing here is sort of simulating a data access layer without having a data access layer. And I'm just going to be storing this stuff in the cache. So you'll see that if you end up restarting your application, your data is going to go back to whatever it was. So what I could do here is I'm going to say, make this fairly simple here. I'm going to say list contact contacts equals, and actually let me go just back one step. I'm going to create a variable which is going to hold my cache. I'm going to call it a couple of different times, and what I'm going to do here, in order to get my cache, I'm going to say system.web http context current cache. Okay? And again, the cache is basically just a way of storing data in memory. Again, every web application on a server operates in its own space, and you have the ability to store data in that space. So what I'm going to do is say cache key. Okay, in order to get this to compile, I'm going to say as list of contact. So what that'll do is that if the data is in the cache, I'll actually have a valid list of contacts. If not, I'm going to have a null value because it's not going to find anything. And again, if I do the as, I won't get an error. If I was to try to cast it, I would get an error. So I'm going to put an if statement here and say, hey, look, if contacts equals null. And if it's null, I'm going to end up creating it, and I'll put it in the cache, and I'll end up returning this value. So I could actually even come down here and say return contacts. And at this point, this will compile. It's not going to work. We don't have a controller or a view to test it at this point. But I'll populate my contacts, and what I'm going to end up doing is eventually adding a bunch of contacts and randomly generate some of the values. So just to start off, I'll say contacts equals new list contact. And I'm going to use the object initializer by putting a couple of contacts in here. New contact. I'll say first name is Eric. Last name is Katz. email is ericpkatz@gmail.com. And again, we're going to end up generating these IDs, but if this was a database-driven application, this would be an identity key that the database would assign an ID. Will give me an ID of 1, and I could add another contact. All right, let me copy this, save a little time here. So again, these are object initializers. And the advantage of an object initializer is, instead of having to create a constructor with all these different possibilities, you can construct the object and set the properties at the same time. And let's actually do 2. And let's say this is going to be Joe Smith. And we'll say joesmith@gmail.com. We'll start out with that. And in the next video, we'll dynamically generate some of these values so we have a little bit more to work with. And before we end up returning them, because if we did this, nothing would ever make it into the cache, we're going to put it in the cache, and we'll say cache.key, cache key equals contacts. Okay. So what we can do here is now we can build this. Right now we have a private method, so there's not really all that much we can do with it. But if we end up doing this, sometimes it could be a little bit tough to figure out where your different properties and methods are. So sometimes I like to do this just to see where I should add the next method. And this is going to be public. This is going to return a list of contact objects. We're going to call it getContacts. It's going to be a real simple method. We're just going to return our internal data. Okay? If you're using this class, you have no idea this is encapsulated in terms of how we're getting the data. But later on, we could go in here and actually create a data access layer and get the data from the database, or wherever else we're going to end up getting the data. We might end up using an XML file. Let's save this. Okay. So let me actually open up my Solution Explorer. So right now, let's go in here and let's put in a controller. We don't have a home controller yet. Let's put one in. So we've got our home controller. It's an empty controller. We'll click Add. Let's create a view for this controller. This is not going to be a strongly typed view. And we'll go in here, and we'll click on Add. We'll put home in here. And we'll put a UL in here with a couple of links. We're going to put an action link. Use our HTML helper. So the text in the link is going to be home. The action is going to be index. And that'll end up working for that link. And for this one, we're going to create this in a little bit. We're going to have a HTML action link. This is going to be for the contact controller. And again, we'll also call index. And we can save this as well. So we've got our home controller. At this point, we could actually start our application, saying start without debugging. And we've got our home controller. If we click on contact, let's see, I must have typed something wrong here. Here's our home controller. Here's contact. Oh, I see what that's happening. So let's be a little bit more specific. I screwed this up. That's going to be home. This is going to be, I apologize, this is going to be index for the home controller. My mistake. And this is going to be index for the contact controller. And I actually realized I made one more mistake here. I actually don't want to put this in the home controller. So what ends up happening here with Razor is that unless you specify other words, and you have the ability to do that, they're all going to end up using this layout file. In fact, you have some stuff that's in here. We're not going to be using. We're going to use jQuery. We'll get to that in a little bit. I'm going to take this out. We'll use this style sheet in the body of our page. We'll put in this, and I'm going to save it. Let me go back to our browser. Okay. And now if we click on contact, this should break. Right, home, we'll just refresh this page. So what we can do is we can go to our home controller. We'll create it first. So we're going to say add controller. And it's going to be, our contact controller. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to put in a constructor here. So this is something we haven't done before. And the other thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to say that we're going to have a property here, ContactBus. ContactBus. Okay, I don't have a value for it. It doesn't recognize the name because if you look at the namespace, this is ContactWeb controllers, and that's in ContactWeb models. If I do that, control dot, it'll find that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a constructor in here. Now, we're not going to call this constructor directly, okay? But there's actually a class, a default class that will instantiate the controllers based upon your route. Again, everything is working through the actions of controllers, and I have the ability here to put in a constructor, which will end up getting called, okay? And at this point, I'm going to say, hey, look, my business layer is going to have a new ContactBus. What this allows me to do really easily is to just say, hey, look, my model is going to be ContactBus. Right now, this is a property that has an instance of our data logic, of our logic class. Now I've got a public method called getContacts. And again, notice when you did this here, you don't have access to that private property, and that's the way it should be because it's encapsulated, and we're going to actually switch it out later on so that it ends up getting the data from a data access layer. We could return our model here, and if we right-click here, we could say Add View. Now, what I'm going to do here is that this is going to be a strongly typed view. Okay, and it's going to be contact. Again, if you don't see your classes here that you create, it's usually, you have to build it first. If you don't build it, it's not going to recognize the class. If you end up having an error when you're building, that class might not end up getting created. So make sure, you build things a little bit at a time. We don't need our script libraries, but what I'm going to do here is say that this is a list. Well, this is kind of interesting because now what I do is it's going to put scaffolding. It's basically going to loop over all the properties of my each of these contacts, and have an item for each of these contacts. It'll do it in a table layout, but we can move it to an unordered list and style it the way that we want to. If I click on Add here, what you're going to see is that what I get here is an enumerable, an enumerable collection of our contacts. Now, this is going to work for us because we have a list, and a list is enumerable. We could put list here, but if we decided to call this with, let's say, an array or something else, we would end up running into a problem. So, this is a little bit more general, and gives us a little bit more flexibility. So here, what you're seeing is that I'm looping over the model, and I say display for the first name, display for the last name. Since these are text properties, it's just going to actually put these inside of labels. If I build this, and I go back to my browser, and I click on contact, I'll get a list of these objects. Again, none of these things are going to work, but we'll fix them in a second. We'll also, fix these display names by putting some data annotations into our contact class. All right, so I'll be back in a little bit with the second video.